When we talk about memory, we usually think of images, stories, and moments we can recall. But the most powerful memories are not stored in the mind alone. They live deep inside the physical body. They are encoded directly into the nervous system, resting tightly within the muscles, echoing in the rhythm of the breath, and shaping the exact way the heart has learned to protect itself. This is why someone can firmly claim they have completely moved on, forgiven every wrong, or entirely forgotten the past, yet still feel restless, anxious, or profoundly empty without ever knowing why. The physical body remembers everything that the conscious mind tries so desperately to escape. For the narcissist, this physical reality is especially true. Much of their fragile identity is built entirely on denial, on constantly rewriting the past to preserve an image of themselves that feels safe and tolerable to look at. They may tell themselves over and over that whatever harmful thing they did was completely justified, heavily exaggerated, or simply misunderstood by everyone else. They may even manage to convince other people around them of the exact same story. But the human nervous system does not respond to clever stories or manufactured excuses. It responds only to raw truth. And truth, whenever it is actively avoided, turns directly into chronic tension. There is a very real reason why so many people who cause harm to others live day after day with a constant, grinding sense of agitation or deep dissatisfaction. It is not because they are being punished by some mystical fate or external karma. It is simply because their bodies are desperately holding on to experiences they never once allowed themselves to genuinely feel. Guilt, shame, fear, and profound grief do not magically disappear just because they are ignored. They go underground, sinking deep into the physical vessel. They show up persistently as relentless restlessness, sudden bursts of rage, emotional numbness, or a desperate, constant need for endless distraction. Whatever remains unintegrated inside the human psyche inevitably becomes internal pressure. From a true psychological perspective, trauma is not simply what happened to you from the outside. Trauma is actually what happens inside us when we are entirely unable to process what happened. When the narcissist inflicted deep harm on someone else, they simultaneously created a severe, bleeding wound within their own soul. But instead of bravely facing that pain, they chose to construct an elaborate false self to hide from it. They learned how to control every situation, perform for every audience, and manipulate every relationship so they would never ever have to feel the full, crushing weight of what they actually did. Yet the ultimate cost of that relentless avoidance is a lifetime of chronic disconnection from their own inner life. This is precisely why no amount of external success, endless admiration, or constant attention can ever truly satisfy them. Their nervous system is still carrying that unresolved experience in the background. It is still bracing itself for impact. It is still scanning the horizon for threats. It is still tightly holding onto what was never safely released. They may appear outwardly confident and completely unshakable, but on the inside, there is almost always a quiet chaos they can never quite name. There is a persistent sense that something vital is missing, something is terribly wrong, and something remains completely unresolved. And this is precisely where the undeniable truth finally catches up with them. The human body is never interested in self-deception. It is naturally designed to move toward wholeness and healing. It seeks true resolution, not an endless performance for the crowd. When someone stubbornly refuses to feel their own emotions, the body steps in to become the faithful keeper of what was denied. Every single attempt to outrunning the past only tightens the iron grip of what remains unhealed for you. Understanding this dynamic can be profoundly and deeply liberating. It shifts the entire narrative away from the exhausting pursuit of revenge and brings you right back into reality. You no longer need them to finally admit what they did. You no longer need validation or an apology from the very person who caused the harm in the first place. The natural consequences are already actively unfolding right now, not through some dramatic punishment, but simply through the basic, undeniable mechanics of being human. Whatever is not faced head-on is carried as a heavy load. Whatever is not properly healed is mindlessly repeated. Whatever is not allowed to be felt is silently stored away. You were never crazy for deeply feeling the immense impact of what happened to you. Your nervous system was simply responding accurately to the truth. And now, as you walk your own path of healing, you are finally releasing what never belonged to you in the first place. There is another essential layer to this truth that is so often overlooked by people. It is not only the harm they cause that stays permanently with them, but also the vibrant parts of you they tried so hard to erase, the bright confidence they mocked, the deep sensitivity they dismissed, the healthy boundaries they deeply resented, and the brilliant light they attempted to dim. None of that ever truly disappears into the void. It becomes a permanent, silent presence, echoing in their inner world, serving as an ongoing reminder of something they could never control and could never destroy. When someone tries to break another human being, they are actually revealing the exact things that deeply threaten them. Your strength, your depth, your incredible capacity to love and feel deeply were never weaknesses at all. They were shining mirrors, reflecting back the exact things the narcissist could never tolerate within themselves. They attacked you not because you were flawed or broken, but precisely because you were alive in ways they never were. And even now, those exact qualities follow them around like a lingering shadow. Psychologically speaking, this entire dynamic is deeply rooted in projection and blind envy. The narcissist sees reflected in you the very traits they had to aggressively suppress in order to survive their own childhoods. Real authenticity, genuine vulnerability, and true emotional presence. Rather than having the courage to mourn what they lost inside themselves, they try to ruthlessly eliminate it in you. But attempting to eliminate it never brings them peace. It only intensifies their internal conflict. What they tried so hard to destroy in you becomes the very thing that haunts their quiet hours. They may move on to completely new relationships, new environments, and entirely new versions of themselves to escape. But the exact same toxic pattern quietly reassembles itself. They inevitably encounter someone who reminds them, even on an unconscious level, of you. Someone who carries that same bright light, that same fierce independence, and that same unshakable emotional truth. And once again, they instantly feel that exact same discomfort, that same overwhelming urge to control, and that same dark impulse to diminish someone else. The repeating pattern is never actually about the other person standing in front of them. It is always about what remains entirely unresolved deep within themselves. This is precisely why your ultimate survival is not just a personal victory. It is deeply symbolic. Every single time you choose yourself, every time you grow stronger, and every time you live your life fully, you represent an undeniable truth they can never erase. The truth that you were never the real problem to begin with. Your continued existence boldly challenges the entire false narrative they carefully constructed to justify their poor behavior. You become living, breathing evidence that their desperate attempts to dominate and destroy you did not define who you are. There is also a much deeper philosophical element at play here. What we choose to harm in other people is almost always what we have painfully disowned within ourselves. The narcissist completely disowned their own vulnerability, their genuine human needs, and their terrifying fear of total abandonment. When they see those exact same qualities alive and unashamed in you, it stirs up a profound grief they are utterly incapable of acknowledging. Rather than allowing themselves to feel that heavy grief, they aggressively convert it into bitter contempt or rigid control. But beneath all that loud anger is simply devastating loss. The tragic loss of a true self they never actually learned how to keep. So they carry you right along with them on their journey, not in fond longing, but in haunting memory, not in genuine affection, but in lingering, unfinished business. The specific parts of you they tried so hard to break become painful reminders of the full life they actively avoided. And no matter how far or fast they run away, they can never truly outrun that inner truth. You were never meant to disappear or shrink away. Your beautiful light was never theirs to take from you. And in the quiet, empty places of their lives, they cannot escape it. Your survival speaks clearly for itself. Another heavy truth that relentlessly follows them is the one they worked the hardest to bury out of sight. Deep, persistent guilt. Not the kind that bravely admits itself out loud, but the kind that lives entirely underground, silently shaping a person's entire inner world without their conscious awareness. The narcissist may verbally deny all wrongdoing, heavily justify their toxic choices, and genuinely convince themselves they were simply misunderstood by the world. But the human psyche never truly erases what it fundamentally knows to be true. It simply reorganizes itself around that hidden secret. When profound guilt is never faced squarely, it does not magically vanish into thin air. It turns into a silent, controlling architect. It actively influences the way they view themselves, the way they relate to other human beings, and the way they move through the everyday world. It routinely shows up as relentless defensiveness, knee-jerk blame, and a constant, exhausting need to always be right about everything. It shows up clearly as the complete inability to rest peacefully, to feel truly at ease in their own skin, or to genuinely trust anyone around them. The conscious mind may easily say that they did nothing wrong at all, but the physical body and the deep unconscious mind tell a completely different story. From a clinical and psychological perspective, this is the devastating cost of complete inner disconnection. When someone stubbornly refuses to take genuine responsibility for the harm they caused, they severely fracture their inner world. One part of them quietly knows the undeniable truth of what happened. Another part fights tooth and nail to aggressively suppress it. That ongoing inner conflict creates a permanent tension that never actually resolves itself. They become hopelessly trapped in a continuous loop of self-justification and emotional avoidance. And inside that exhausting loop, there is never any true peace to be found. This is the exact reason why so many people who cause deep harm to others always seem intensely restless or perpetually dissatisfied with their lives. They are not being punished by some mysterious external force from the universe. They are simply living day in and day out with an unresolved internal contradiction. The more fiercely they deny reality, the more rigid and brittle their personality becomes. The more desperately they defend their false narrative, the further they drift away from their own humanity. Guilt, when it is honestly acknowledged and felt, can eventually lead to genuine repair and growth. But when it is tightly buried away, it turns directly into a personal prison. There is also a profound philosophical truth embedded here that we must recognize. We can never truly escape the ultimate consequences of our actions. We can only choose how we interpret them. The narcissist insists on interpreting their past through extreme distortion, but the heavy emotional residue stubbornly remains behind. It continues to shape their fragile self-image in ways they cannot consciously control or modify. They may constantly seek out empty admiration just to feel somewhat worthy or chase absolute dominance just to feel temporarily safe. But all of these elaborate strategies are just desperate attempts to outrun something that lives permanently inside them. For you, deeply understanding this reality can bring an incredible, profound sense of release. You no longer have to carry the exhausting burden of their denial. You no longer need them to finally admit what they did or offer a sincere apology for what they caused. The natural consequences are already fully present right now, not functioning as a punishment, but simply as an internal state of being. Their entire life becomes strictly structured around avoidance, control, and emotional distance, because that is literally the only way they know how to live with the reality they refuse to face. And here is the final, ultimate truth of the matter. Guilt that is never healed does not simply fade away with time. It becomes the permanent architecture of the soul. They may never actually speak the words out loud, but their daily life is already shouting them. What always follows unaddressed guilt is not deep reflection or growth, but mindless repetition. When a person stubbornly refuses to face the raw truth of what they have actually done, they never truly move forward in life. They just walk around in endless circles. The narcissist may abruptly leave one relationship, pack up and leave one job, or escape to one new environment after another, genuinely believing they are finally starting completely fresh. But those exact same toxic patterns quietly reassemble themselves right behind them because the deep wound driving the behavior has never once been addressed. This is one of the most widely misunderstood realities of narcissistic behavior. People often assume that when someone like that finally exits your life, they magically get to walk away completely clean with zero consequences. But psychologically speaking, that is simply not how the human mind works at all. Whatever remains unhealed inside a person is always carried forward into their future. It will always seek expression once again. Not because the person wants to hurt others on purpose, but because unresolved pain always demands some kind of outlet. Until that pain is consciously examined in the light, it will simply recreate itself over and over again. So the narcissist meets brand new people, forms new bonds, and tells a completely different story about who they really are. Yet the emotional dynamic remains eerily familiar. The idealization phase returns for a brief moment, followed closely by subtle control, emotional withdrawal, blame, and eventual collapse. Different faces, but the exact same emotional script. This happens not because of some mystical fate, but because the human psyche always repeats what it cannot resolve, viewed clearly through a trauma-informed lens. This is the classic sign of a nervous system that is deeply stuck in survival mode. The narcissist learned a long time ago that vulnerability was terrifyingly dangerous, and that raw power and a polished image were far safer than true authenticity. Those early defense adaptations once protected them from unbearable pain. But over time, those defenses hardened permanently into rigid personality traits. Now, even when they desperately try to move on, their physical body and their guarded mind automatically return to what feels familiar. They choose dominance instead of true intimacy, and heavy control instead of genuine connection. This endless repetition is not success by any measure. It is profound stagnation, cleverly disguised as forward motion, and it slowly erodes them from the inside out. Each failed cycle leaves behind more emotional debris, broken trust, fractured relationships, and unspoken harm. Over time, the narcissist becomes noticeably more isolated, more deeply disconnected, and more firmly convinced that everyone else in the world is the real problem. But deep down inside, there is a growing, uncomfortable awareness that the common denominator in every single collapse is none other than themselves. Philosophically speaking, this is the unavoidable cost of avoiding self-confrontation. We often mistakenly think that true freedom comes from escaping certain people or physically leaving places behind us. But real freedom actually comes from finally facing the broken patterns living right inside our own minds. Someone refuses to look inward at their own flaws. They remain permanently bound to their own personal history. They live out the exact same painful chapter again and again, blindly hoping the ending will magically change without them ever changing themselves. For you, this profound truth brings a completely different kind of closure. You are not the rare exception that somehow failed. You are simply one chapter in a much larger, ongoing story. They will inevitably continue to repeat these cycles. Their fundamental inability to heal means they will keep recreating the exact same toxic emotional terrain. Even when you are no longer anywhere near them, the ongoing cycle remains their permanent consequence. And here is the final truth of this chapter. What is never healed is never truly left behind. It is simply lived all over again. As this endless cycle continues and the crushing weight of repetition grows heavier day by day, something else begins to happen quietly beneath the surface. The narcissist may still appear confident to the outside world, even superior and untouchable. But internally, the psychological structure that holds their fragile identity together becomes increasingly unstable and weak. This represents the quiet erosion of their false self, the elaborate persona they constructed long ago just to survive, to feel somewhat worthy, and to desperately avoid the unbearable sense of inner emptiness. In the very beginning, that false self feels like the ultimate protective shield. It whispers quietly inside that they are strong, that they are special, and that they are somehow above all of this mess. But every single time a relationship inevitably collapses, and every time a human connection turns toxic, that heavy mask has to work twice as hard just to hold the fabricated story together. The mind is forced to invent brand new justifications, brand new villains, and brand new reasons why nothing that happened is ever their fault. Over time, this mental gymnastics becomes utterly exhausting. The massive amount of energy required to maintain the illusion grows larger every day, while the emotional resources needed to sustain it slowly run completely dry. This is the exact moment where deep cracks begin to form in the armor. The narcissist may experience sudden, unpredictable mood shifts, creeping anxiety, or an unshakable, restless agitation. They may feel deeply threatened by people who are genuinely calm, grounded, or authentic, because those peaceful qualities instantly expose everything they have been running away from within themselves. They are not actually reacting to you as an individual. They are frantically reacting to the painful reflection of a true self they simply cannot tolerate looking at. From a psychological perspective, the false self is never just a harmless mask. It is a deeply ingrained survival adaptation. Many narcissistic patterns originate in early childhood environments where love was entirely conditional, where natural emotions were ignored, or where basic vulnerability was harshly punished. The young child learned early on that they had to become someone completely different just to be accepted. That rigid identity becomes completely fixed over time. And when adulthood finally demands real, genuine connection, the false self is simply incapable of delivering it. It knows how to perform for an audience, but it has no idea how to actually relate to another human being. Philosophically speaking, this creates a profound and painful existential conflict. The person is permanently divided between who they truly are underneath and who they believe they must pretend to be just to survive. The more desperately they cling to their fake persona, the further they drift away from their authentic core. And without true authenticity, there is never any lasting peace. They may achieve high status, endless admiration, or absolute control over their environment, but they remain spiritually and internally homeless. For you, this stage is no longer about seeking revenge or demanding outside validation. It is about deeply understanding that what you experienced was never just random bad luck. You simply encountered someone who was fighting a desperate internal war. You were never rejected because you were somehow unworthy of love. You were pushed away because your healthy presence directly challenged the fragile illusion that kept them psychologically intact. As the false self weakens and begins to fracture, the narcissist is ultimately forced to make a stark choice: either continue defending the fake mask or finally confront the raw truth resting beneath it. Many of them will cowardly choose the mask because facing that hidden pain feels entirely unbearable. But the steep cost of that choice is a lifetime lived in a shallow performance rather than deep connection. And here is the final truth. When the false self finally begins to crumble, the human soul can no longer hide successfully from itself. When that false self can no longer hold the weight, and when the destructive cycles have exhausted even their own elaborate justifications, the narcissist enters a strange stage that is rarely ever visible from the outside world. It is not a dramatic collapse in the traditional sense, but rather a quiet, haunting reckoning. It is a sudden moment when the defensive strategies that once protected them completely stop working, leaving them entirely alone with the raw emotional reality they spent a lifetime avoiding. At this exact point, they may still appear fully functional to outsiders. They may still speak with absolute confidence, still desperately chase after cheap admiration, and still tell a proud story of personal strength, but internally something fundamental has shifted. The outside world feels far less convincing to them now. The familiar rush of control no longer provides the same temporary relief it once did. They begin to feel a hollow emptiness that no new relationship, external achievement, or flood of validation can ever possibly fill. From a trauma-informed point of view, this is precisely what happens when the human nervous system has been trapped in chronic survival mode for decades on end. The physical body grows bone-tired. The guarded mind grows rigid and inflexible. There is simply no emotional room left for true flexibility, genuine curiosity, or personal growth. The narcissist becomes hopelessly trapped in a very narrow emotional range, entirely unable to experience real joy or deep intimacy. They can be surrounded by a crowd of people, yet remain fundamentally, profoundly alone. This stage is not about some external punishment being handed down. It is simply about natural consequence, not imposed from the outside world, but generated entirely from within their own choices. Every single human being requires authentic connection, radical honesty, and emotional truth to truly feel alive. When those basic human needs are denied for far too long, the inner psyche simply withers away. What is left behind is a crushing sense of isolation that no amount of attention or praise can ever soothe. Philosophically, this is the exact place where the grand illusion of absolute control finally dissolves into nothingness. The narcissist always genuinely believed they could shape reality through sheer image and dominance. But reality, in the end, is always shaped by the true quality of our inner life. When that inner life is built entirely on a foundation of avoidance, it becomes a terribly fragile structure. Eventually, it simply cannot support the massive weight of human existence. For you, this marks the final closing of the story. Not because you get to watch them suffer in some visible way, but because you are finally no longer bound to their chaotic inner struggle.